the year pretty rough reading this book. She's just on her own agenda. Taryn will forever be the father figure that we all need. I just need a moment to kind of compose my thoughts. 2025 is nearly here. I don't know about you guys, but I just cannot believe that the year is almost over. Personally, this was my best reading year I think I've ever had in my entire life. A couple years ago, I started reading again after college and got back into it because of ACOTAR, as most of us have experienced. And it was just kind of all downhill from there, but in the best way possible. And I thought, what better time to do a end of year book tag than right now? If you're new here, as we all are, because I'm also new here, my name is Heidi and I love to read and I love to yap about books. It's basically my whole personality. My friends and family are very supportive of it, but it's just not quite the same when you're yapping about books to people who don't love books as much as you do. So here we are. If you like this video, please do subscribe and like. If you have any content ideas, please drop it in the comments. I am all ears. We are all new here and I want to give the people what they want. I will absolutely jump on that train and create any content that you're looking for. I am also on TikTok and Instagram as the Wander Reader, so you can find me there as well. If you aren't familiar with their pages, I was inspired by Larry and Mariana, who also just started her official booktube. I just watched their book tags and just thought that that was such a fun idea and also a really great way to reflect on the wins and maybe some not so good wins of the books of the year. So if you haven't seen their videos, please do check them out. I got a lot of the questions from their videos that I'm going to go through today, but I also added a few of my own because I did different reading formats that I didn't see included in those particular questions that they had listed. I do just want to preface that obviously these questions will include things like my least favorite books of the year, my favorite books of the year. I just kind of abide by the whole 5 stars as a feeling rule. Generally, I just don't judge people who love books that I didn't love. In fact, if I rated a book very poorly that you loved, please just know there is nobody more disappointed than I am. I promise. Like, I bought the book intending to love it. So if you see a book on here that maybe I have a differing opinion from yours, just know it's not personal and maybe I'll get around to rereading it and I'll have a whole different opinion. And if that's the case, I will make another video on that. But in general, these are just my overall opinions of these books. Of the 82 books that I've read so far this year, my average rating is a 3.98, which I actually thought was pretty low considering I've had several 5-star reads this year. I have rated 26 books this year 5 stars, 5 full stars, not 4.75, 5 full stars. So the fact that my average is still 3.98, I feel like I started off the year reading some books that I thought I was going to love just because they were popular on Book Talk, and I ended up not loving them. Come mid-year, I set a rule for myself that I wasn't going to read books that I didn't already trust the author that were below 4 stars. Since sticking to that rule, I think my average 5-star ratings have gone up substantially. All of my favorite books that I've read this year, and actually some of my favorite books of all time, I read on the second half of this year. So I think setting that rule for myself really helped me read books and be more selective with the books that I really knew I was going to enjoy. I also just stuck with genres that I knew I was gonna love. My top genres of the year were fantasy, romance, and contemporary. Contemporary actually surprised me. That's a new genre. I generally don't read contemporary literary fiction. I read several of those this year and they ended up being some of my favorite 5-star reads of the year. First question, who were my favorite book characters of the year? I actually went pretty much with all female characters, mostly because I feel like I rate like my favorite female characters and my favorite book boyfriends a little bit differently. But I have a couple books this year. I'll start off with the one male that I did choose, and I say male because it is Marcellus the octopus. He is just so precious and darling to me, and I was obsessed with this book, and his character, I did the audiobook for this, was just lovely. Absolutely hilarious. I was laughing out loud. He is the most sarcastic little guy you can ever imagine. I was just obsessed with him. Then I have 3 favorite female characters of the year that I am just absolutely obsessed with in every way, shape, and form. Starting off, we have Elizabeth Zott from Lessons in Chemistry. She is absolutely, outside of fantasy, the strongest female character I have ever read. I would love to meet Elizabeth Zott in person if she were real. If she had a TV show like she does in the book, I would watch it every single day. I would watch her YouTube. I would listen to her podcast. I want this woman to tell me how I need to get my life together. She's just absolutely an inspiration. I don't care who you are, where you are in the world, how old you are. At some point, I hope everyone reads this book. This is one I think a genius, and only a genius, could have written. And Elizabeth Zott, she is my hero, honestly. Next, of course, in my favorite characters of the year, we have Aelin Galathynius. This book in particular is when I really started to love her character, so that's why I chose this one. In the beginning, I'll be honest, she didn't quite click with me. Maybe because she was just still young and like the book started off pretty YA, but honestly, as it went on, I just love how she's just on her own agenda. She doesn't tell anyone what she's doing. She doesn't tell anyone what her master plan is. She just lets them experience it unfurling. She doesn't care if they get mad at her for not telling them what her plan is. She knows what she needs to do and she doesn't let anybody stand in her way. And that is why, no spoilers, her love interest in these books is my absolute favorite, because he really just stands back and lets her thrive, but also supports her the moment she needs it. I love that. And finally, my last favorite character of the year, I know I had several, but it is Evie from the Assistant to the Villain series. I read Apprentice to the Villain this year and just loved it almost even more than the first book. I love these books so very much, but Evie is just the cutest, sweetest character ever. If you just want like a true sunshine female character, look no further. She reminds me a lot of Rapunzel in Tangled. Actually, this whole series definitely gives me Grumpy Sunshine, Flynn Rider, Rapunzel vibes, so if you like that, this is a really good series to look into. My new favorite author that I discovered this year would be Ashley Poston. I started off with Dead Romantic, 7 Year Slip, and then read a novel love story. Of those three, I really love the first two the most, but 7 Year Slip stood out to me. There's just something so magical about her writing. It reminds me a lot of Emily Henry and the joy that it brings me. If you enjoy books with a little bit of whimsy or a little bit of magic, but don't necessarily need it to be explained in order for you to enjoy the book, then you would probably really enjoy her writing. Speaking of Emily Henry, my favorite book club book of the year that we read was Happy Place. This was my second Emily Henry book that I have read, and this one basically put me into an early midlife crisis. It really just made me question things about my goals in life, the people I surround myself with, and the ability to let go of the past in order to pursue the future that you actually want. This was beautiful. We had a really great conversation around this book during my book club as well, and I think that's one of the reasons it means so much to me. Not everybody resonated with this book, and the people who didn't really enjoy this book as much as I did, I very much understand why. There was a lot of miscommunication in this book, which generally miscommunication is a trope I just cannot get behind. It's one that really frustrates me when I'm reading it. But this one, as with most Emily Henry books, there is usually really good closure and a happy ending of sorts, so I think that's why it didn't bug me as much, is because I kind of assumed I was gonna get what I wanted at the end of this book. Because we had such a great conversation around this book, I got to learn a lot about my friends and their values in their lives through the discussion that we had around Happy Place. So outside of how this book resonated with me on a personal level, this book will also hold a special place in my heart because of everything that my friends and I got to talk about while discussing this book. This next question is one that I wanted to include because it's one that I don't see people talking about enough, and that is my favorite platonic relationships in books that I read this year. Everyone talks about their favorite couples or their favorite book boyfriends, but I don't see platonic relationships in books. There's found family, but I think a platonic friendship and relationship is one step further than found family. My two absolute favorite platonic relationships that I read this year were Aelin and Fenris, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if you know, you know. Their relationship just means truly everything to me, and the language that they created to support each other really just did something to me, and I think about it probably daily. And my other favorite platonic relationship that I read about this year was Scarlett and Constance in The Things We Leave Unfinished. This is about two sisters and the lengths they will go to in order to protect and love each other and support each other. This book broke me in a way I don't think any other book has, and this was just truly a beautiful, devastating read, and their sisterly love was one that I probably will never read about again. Next is my favorite book couple of the year, and I'm trying not not to repeat books, but you already know if I could repeat books, I would absolutely choose Rowan and Aelin. But I feel like that just kind of is like goes unsaid. So I thought of some others that I think were really, really great book couples that I was not expecting. And one of them is Araya and Rain from the Crowns of Nyaxia series. This book caught me off guard. I did the audiobook and they were fantastic, but I bought the book because I loved the slow burn of this romance so much. It really was a true slow burn and a true enemies to lovers. I feel like lately every book is a enemies to lovers or a slow burn, and by page 50 they're no longer enemies and the wick has burnt out. It is not a slow burn. This was one of those, and I think that's why I really loved this relationship. One of my other favorite book couples of the year was Emma and Justin from Just for the Summer. This book was so darling. I adored it. It was so, so fun. And just the way that Justin takes care of Emma and is like truly an acts of service man, I thought that was very, very sweet. Acts of service and quality time. So if those are your love languages, you will love this book. But also both characters have their own personal trauma that they're working through, and the way that they support each other and don't judge each other through those times of change was really, really beautiful to me. Next, a book that surprised me this year, and this one actually really did surprise me. I feel like this is gonna be kind of controversial, but hear me out. Tower of Dawn. I was not expecting this book to be the masterpiece that it was. Let's just talk about Chaol and Irene for a moment. That redemption arc for Sir Chaol blew me away. Nobody is talking about what this man went through, and this was just truly, truly incredible. I didn't do the tandem read for this. I read Empire of Storms and then I read Tower of Dawn. Just watching the character growth, the struggle that he went through, and watching Irene really come into her power and them using their relationship to better each other and to better themselves and giving each other the room to grow and forgiving each other and themselves for their mistakes. This was just truly one of my favorite books in the whole series. I'll be honest, the whole Throne of Glass series didn't capture me from page 1. I didn't really start to enjoy the series until Queen of Shadows, and I didn't really start to see where the series was going until end of Empire of Storms and then this book. This book, I was starting to see the web come together, and I didn't even do the tandem read, and maybe that's why I just really enjoyed this. I loved seeing in this book all of the Easter eggs that had been planted start to come to fruition. This is a book I don't understand why it gets so much hate, especially compared to other books in the series. And this is the controversial opinion, but I genuinely thought Tower of Dawn was better than 3 of the earlier books in the series. I won't say which 3 because everyone has different opinions, but this was one I devoured this book. And this is one I cannot wait to read again, and I do plan to do the tandem read because I want to experience that. Following that, of course, we have the question, what was my most disappointing read of the year? And this is another one that might be controversial, but there are reasons. And again, I respect you if you loved this book. Just personally, I had such high hopes for this book and it fell so short. And this is not to offend anybody. I promise you, I am devastated that I didn't love this book. But that was Iron Flame. When I tell you Fourth Wing, nothing could fill the hole that I felt in my heart after finishing ACOTAR, but Fourth Wing did. And I loved it so much. I read it in like 2 days. I was so excited for this book to come out. I truly was like itching to get my hands on this book. It came in, I started reading it immediately. It took me 6 months to read this book. I just don't understand why it is so long. I've heard some things like Rebecca Yarros actually wanted Iron Flame to be 2 separate books, but her publisher forced her to merge it all together into one. And I am not blaming her at all for this. Everything that she wanted to come to fruition in this book did come to fruition in the end. And I appreciate all of that, and I do appreciate the plot twists and everything, but the book itself was just so slow. I felt like nothing really happened in it because I felt this is one there was a lot of character growth in Fourth Wing between Violet and Xaden. And I felt like everything that they had achieved in Fourth Wing disappeared in this book. And part of that is because of the miscommunication. I can appreciate a temporary miscommunication trope, but to have a miscommunication trope go on for 700 pages was a lot. And it was just, for me, that doesn't keep my interest, and I found it a little boring. Now, I do know there are reasons for the miscommunication, which I'm sure I'll see in the comments, like something to do with her signet, and obviously Xaden trying to keep the rebellion a secret. I understand all of that. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to just read a couple acting like children, and I know that they're young. This book just did not live up to the hype for me. I will be reading Onyx Storm, and I really, really hope they just start communicating in Onyx Storm. I'll be honest, out of this entire book, I will say the people who annoyed me the least were not the people I expected, like Dane and Jack Barlow. They were on my good list, I'm gonna be honest. Dane, I see a Chaol redemption arc coming. Jack Barlow saved her life. Jack Barlow actually did a good thing for once in that book, which blew me away. I feel like she's kind of writing a redemption arc for him too, which I think all of those things were also what led me to being so annoyed by Xaden and Violet. In this book, there was no communication, and the only thing that they did when they were together was sleep together. And I love a good romance. I will eat that up so fast. To me, that's just not enough grounds for a real relationship, and that's why this book was really disappointing to me. I'll get off my soapbox now. I understand that there were probably a lot of really good things in this book that I missed. One of those reasons is probably because it took me 6 months to get through this, but I was just generally very bored, and the only thing I looked forward to in this book was the dragons and Tairn. Tairn will forever be the father figure that we all need, and I will read this series until it's complete just for him. Speaking of dragons, the most underhyped book that I read this year, which I thought was underhyped, was When the Moon Hatched. This was one I actually bought when it first released. I was about to read it. I read the glossary, which was so extensive, and I got intimidated. And then I saw a bunch of people saying that this book didn't live up to the hype, and so I got a little scared. Finally, I picked it up. I got over the glossary. I loved this. I read it in 3 days. This was not what I was expecting. This kind of filled the fourth wing hole in my heart that I'd had after being disappointed with Iron Flame. And maybe that's why I love this book. Maybe it actually isn't as good as I thought it was, but it followed Iron Flame for me, and I just thought it was 10 times better than I expected it to be. The romance in this was a lot of fun, and definitely a very masculine male character pining after his woman, which, you know, eat that up every time. But I also really loved the politics in this book. You can tell that it's gonna go a lot further in her upcoming books. I also very much enjoyed the presence of the dragons and how there are dragons that exist in this world, but also dragons that became moons. I think the part of this book that resonated with me the most was kind of the mythology and folklore surrounding the dragons and the moons. You get a lot of flashbacks to mythology and music that the bards sing about the dragons, and I just really loved all of that, and I thought it was very beautiful, the storytelling within the story. It's something called ekphrasis, and it's a story within a story, art within art, and this was one that I felt pulled that off very well, and I don't get to see very often in fantasy books anymore, so this was very beautiful. If you're like me and you picked this up and you read the glossary and you're like, oh hell no, and you got intimidated, trust me, I did the same thing. What I would recommend is try not to read the glossary front to back before starting this book. Just get familiar with what the glossary has to offer, like characters and creatures. And then as you read, if you have questions, go back to the glossary and it'll probably answer it for you. That's what I ended up doing when I did pick this book up, and it was way less intimidating than trying to read the glossary all the way through, because that just felt like way too much information and not enough context. If you are intimidated by the glossary, I would just say start with chapter 1 and backtrack to the glossary if you need it. Next, the most overhyped book I've read this year, and again, this one will probably be controversial, but hear me out. One Dark Window. When I tell you my expectations were so high with this book, I thought the magic system was going to be outstanding, which I'll be honest, I actually really loved the magic system in One Dark Window. That was not my problem with this book. My problem with this book was I genuinely don't know what happened, and I don't remember a single thing about this book. I couldn't tell you the characters' names. I closed the last page, and up until this video, have not thought about it since. And I read this back in May. This book was just very forgettable. I think I gave it 2.5 or 3 stars immediately after reading it. One thing I will say is I've heard that for the people who liked this book, they liked the second book even better. So I do have the second book. I haven't wanted to pick it up. This book did actually put me into a reading slump. I just feel like nothing really happened. It wasn't really a slow burn, but I've heard the second book brings in relationships that people weren't expecting to see, and you also get more points of view, which I tend to enjoy while reading. So I actually have a feeling that even though this book was a very big disappointment and what I think is an overhyped book, I will say I do think I probably will enjoy the second book more. I plan to read that one next year. I don't plan to pick it up anytime super soon unless somebody convinces me otherwise. But of all the books that I read this year that I saw hype on other platforms, this was one that I thought was extremely overhyped and just didn't resonate with me as much as I thought it would. This year, I ended up getting an Audible subscription, and I did a ton of audiobooks this year, mostly because my commute to work is pretty long. So each day I can probably get about 2 hours of an audiobook in, which I feel like is a lot and probably the reason I flew through so many audiobooks this year. But that being said, some of my favorite books this year were audiobooks, and I think it's because the performance in these were just absolutely award-winning phenomenal. I had several favorite audiobooks this year. It was really hard to choose from. So I'm just gonna give a couple honorable mentions here because these were just so good, and I will be keeping these forever because I absolutely already want to listen to these again. And a lot of these I ended up buying the actual book so that I could go and maybe listen to the audiobook and annotate while I listen, or just reread because the audiobook was so good it made me want to read the book physically. One of my favorite audiobooks this year was actually my first Kristen Hanna book, and that was The Women. This book really kickstarted my historical fiction love in 2024. This book was so good. I ended up watching a ton of documentaries about the Vietnam War after this and just sparked up a lot of great conversations with people that I know who had also read this book. But the performance in The Women was absolutely outstanding. When I tell you, she had me sobbing. I was just driving in my car on my way to work, and I went into work with like mascara streaks down my face. No, not really, but like probably actually. I just didn't know it. That audiobook had me sitting in my car contemplating life in the parking lot, not wanting to go into work because it was outstanding. Some of my other favorite audiobooks of this year were Lessons in Chemistry. Again, the narrator for this was just outstanding. Remarkably Bright Creatures, the voice narrator for Marcellus was absolutely precious. Loved it. I am currently listening to Quicksilver right now, and I think performance-wise, when it comes to energy and different dialogues, Quicksilver takes the cake. The female narrator really only narrates one character, so I don't get to see a lot of variance from her, but she is outstanding. She adds a lot of emotion into her voice when she reads, and she really just pulls you into the moment. The male narrator for this voice acts for multiple male characters, and he adds different accents to them. Some of them are old, some of them are young, some of them are woodland creatures and fairies, and he just does it all. It is very impressive what he can do with his voice, and I've been enjoying every moment of Quicksilver so far just from the performance alone. And then one final favorite audiobook of the year was Serpent and the Wings of Night. The first and second one were narrated differently. The first one, it was just a woman narrating the whole thing, but I want to say that she did a male voice so well, she had me questioning things about myself. In the second book, they brought in a male voice actor and he just killed it. He was so good. He was everything I wanted Rain to be and everything I wanted him to sound like, but I will never ever forget that she came first and she narrated Rain first, and that was still like one of the best spy scenes I've ever listened to, and it was a woman narrating it. It was just incredible. Next question is an author that did not work out for me this year, and that would be Carly Fortune. I read This Summer Will Be Different, and I'll be honest, this summer was in fact not different. This was almost exactly a Happy Place ripoff. Maybe it's because I read Happy Place literally immediately before this book, but they were just so similar. This book just did not impress me at all. I think I gave it 2 stars. I skimmed this book on the back 50% just because I was so bored of it. It just did not feel very original to me, and her writing also wasn't as magical to me as Emily Henry's is, so I would just rather read an Emily Henry book. The award for happiest book that I read this year absolutely goes to Accomplice to the Villain, and that is not because there wasn't trials and errors throughout this book. The characters went through it. There was a lot of struggles. All that being said, this series just brings me so much joy. And I just can't tell you how happy these books make me. These are just absolute comfort reads, and not because they're poorly written comfort reads. Like, these are so well written. I love the world building in this. I love the characters. All the characters are so different and just so lovable, even with their flaws. The banter in this is precious. The awkward moments in this make me laugh out loud. If you want a book that makes you giggle and kick your feet, this series does that for me. And every time I will literally just be like giggling in my little reading chair, and like, people in public probably think I'm crazy if I were reading this at like a coffee shop or something, but this book just, if you read, can you just tell I just love this book? Next, we have the saddest book that I read this year. I'm gonna start with my honorable mention, which is A Little Life. This was the first book that I read in 2024. Yeah, we started off the year pretty rough reading this book. This book was beautiful, but this is also a book I will not recommend to anybody because it is a book that I think it is completely up to you if you want to go in and read. I do not think everybody needs to read this book. I do not think everybody is going to love this book if they read it. I don't even know if I loved this book. I'm like on the line of like trying to figure out, did I absolutely love this book or did I not love this book? I have no idea, but this book was heartbreaking, and the award would go to this book as the saddest book I read this year if I hadn't read Salt to the Sea. Salt to the Sea was by far the saddest book I read this year, not because it made me cry the most, because it actually didn't, but because Salt to the Sea is based off of a true story, whereas A Little Life is not. And for that reason, even though this one made me cry more, Salt to the Sea has to be the saddest book that I read this year. If you are not familiar with the story, I'll just give a brief synopsis. During World War II, there was a ship that was sunk that had almost 10,000 refugees on it, and nearly 10,000 of them did not survive. And if you are not familiar with the numbers, that is almost 5 times more than the people who didn't survive the Titanic. And that's just a very heavy, heavy thing to come to grips with. If you love Titanic and you want a book that reminds you of the Titanic, this one was beautiful. It's multiple points of view. There is a romance in it. There is a lot of trauma. I don't know if there are trigger warnings written into this, but just know this is based off a true story. It is very dark, but it is also one of the most beautiful books that I read this year. And this is a book I probably think about every day. And of all the historical events and historical tragedies that I am aware of, this is one that does not get talked about enough. There is a reason for that, which I will not go into, but just know if you look into the story behind this book, you'll actually find it very hard to find information on it, and that's because it's not being made known to the public as much as it should. And I'll just end it there. Next question is the most frustrating book that I read this year, and I actually have 2, but for very different reasons. We'll start off with True Crime Story. This book is basically about a girl who goes missing, and they're interviewing everybody around her during that time period who might have knowledge of how she went missing. This book frustrated me because not only does nothing come to fruition at the end, but the author actually writes himself into the book as a suspect, and there are disclaimers in the beginning that all that was done just in kind of jest and as a creative venture, not actually because he's a suspect. This isn't actually a true story, and it just got very confusing, and honestly it kind of tainted his character as a true human being, and it made me not want to read any other books of his. I get the feeling that this is also not his actual name and it's a pseudonym, and maybe he writes other books and goes by that. I don't know. This book just, the premise behind it really confused me. This book took me, again, 6 months to read because I just didn't get it. I wish I did, but it was just kind of disappointing and frustrating, and it also gave me a bit of the ick because I don't know why an author would do something that could potentially ruin their reputation in real life just because they thought it'd be fun to write themselves into their own book. It just was a bit confusing. The other book that I found most frustrating this year, and again, this might be a hot take, I promise it's actually not as bad as it sounds. Magnolia Parks. I picked up this book completely blind. I'm just gonna say that. Holy crap, I was not expecting the cheating trope. That was really, really hard for me. I am not drawn to the cheating trope whatsoever. I'm also not drawn to the miscommunication trope, which also is in this book. And I just felt like everyone in this book was very, very shallow, and I get it. I think that that's the point. It's kind of similar to Gossip Girl. They're all just off in La La Land. They're not actually living in the real world. Like, I get all that. So Magnolia Parks, this book, I did not enjoy. All that being said, I did read Daisy Hates. That redeemed the whole series for me. Daisy Hates was just such an incredible read for me. I cannot wait to continue this series for Daisy Hates. I will read all of Magnolia Park's books, front to back. I will annotate them, I'll do the whole thing. But I already know in my heart of hearts that the Daisy Hates part of this universe is really what I'm gonna be drawn to. The best book adaptation into a movie or TV show that I read this year is actually a very recent read for me, and that is Normal People. I just need a moment to kind of compose my thoughts about what I want to say because this book was simultaneously the most moving and also the most dull book I have ever read. And there are reasons for that. This author, Sally Rooney, does not put quotation marks around her dialogue. This is the first book that I've ever read where that has been a writing style. So if you look at her books, there's actually no quotations around her dialogue. And maybe having no quotations around dialogue doesn't seem like a big deal, but for me, I really felt like I had to reprogram my brain to understand this book and to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. Now, here is why this is the best adaptation that I read this year. I started watching the show. I just want to say that Paul Mescal and Daisy Edgar Jones really brought to life these characters in a way that I had not even imagined them while reading this book and that I didn't think was possible. These characters suffer a lot of insecurity and anxiety. So I think before you go into reading this book, just know that it is a very difficult read for those reasons. They go through a lot of trauma and just a lot of anxiety is being written in this book. They did the show so well. Not only was it filmed beautifully, but the script is nearly identical to the book. They kept it very true to the book, which I really, really appreciate when screen adaptations do that and they don't take artistic liberty and twist the book out of proportion just for the sake of making it a better show or a better movie. But the acting just moved me so much. Normal People, the book, did not make me cry, but I sobbed while watching the show. And the reason this show wins Best Adaptation of a Book is because watching the show made me want to reread the book, and I just finished this book a couple weeks ago. This book actually put me into a reading slump. So my plan when I pick this one up again is actually to go in and draw the quotations around the dialogue. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but you know what? You gotta do what you gotta do. That being said, I think personally, potentially, one of the reasons that maybe she didn't include quotations around dialogue is because the characters go through a lot of miscommunication due to their anxiety and not being able to express how they feel. Not having quotations around the dialogue made certain parts of the book very confusing. Who said what? Did they actually say what I thought they said, or was that just a thought and that actually wasn't dialogue? After watching the show, I now appreciate the lack of quotations a lot more in this book, and I feel like it wouldn't bother me the second time around. I do feel like this is a book that will grow on me over time, but it wasn't one that I enjoyed right off the bat. I'm actually very much an introvert, so yapping at a camera, which is basically like talking to myself, is actually kind of on par with what introverts do, I feel like, but I also feel like I need a little caffeine boost in order to get through this video. So if you're a social introvert, if you know, you know. It's just who are we? Are we just all wearing a mask and pretending to be somebody that we're not? I don't know. Next, we have my favorite book covers of the year. I have several of these. Some of these are because I did the audiobook, but the book was actually just so beautiful that I had to buy it. So my favorite covers of the year were Remarkably Bright Creatures, The 7-Year Slip, Just for the Summer, and Apprentice to the Villain. I really love the Assistant and Apprentice to the Villain covers, and she also just released her cover for book 3, Accomplice to the Villain, which is so cute, and it also strays from the original color scheme that she stuck with for the first 2 books, so I love that. And also if you get early copies of her books, you get sprayed edges as well, so of course I'm doing that, but they're also just so cute, and I just loved all these covers. They brought me a lot of joy, and I think I just really appreciated the color schemes in all of these as well. Next question is a book that I have not been able to stop thinking about, and I feel like I've covered a couple already in this video, but I have 2 other series in general that I want to talk about that I have not stopped thinking about in some way, shape, or form at least once a day since reading them, and they're very, very, very different. But the first is the Throne of Glass series for obvious reasons. And the second is the Ice Planet Barbarian series, probably for less obvious reasons. This series, obviously, there's just so many moving parts and so many different characters that at least once a day I find myself thinking of at least a character or a scene or a funny quote or a not so funny quote or a serious moment or a cry-worthy moment from this series. The Ice Planet series, y'all, I know this is not for everyone, but I love this series so much. It just brings me so much joy and it is absolutely my comfort read. These books also get me out of my reading slump every single time. So I'm up to book 4. This is the first book in this series, but I think about these books probably daily in some way, shape, or form just because they make me giggle and kick my feet, and I'll just have a random thought of like a blue boy alien showing up randomly sometimes. So these are books I also think about quite often. Next is a book that I loved that is either an unpopular book or a book that gets a lot of hate, and that is Bride. This was my first Ali Hazelwood book, and I'll be honest, I bought this, I was so excited to read it, and then I saw like all of the Ali Hazelwood fans kind of giving this book a lot of hate, which obviously you don't like seeing that a well-loved author wrote a book that people don't like, but also it made me a little nervous to read this as my first Ali Hazelwood book, but I really enjoyed this. I'll be honest, I do read a lot of fantasy, sci-fi, romance, so this book was up to speed with what I enjoy. To the best of my knowledge, Ali Hazelwood does not write paranormal, fantasy, sci-fi, romance usually, and I think this was her first book doing that, and so I can understand why, like, I can imagine if Emily Henry all of a sudden just wrote an alien romance, that would catch a lot of people off guard. So I can understand why people didn't like this book because it's not similar to her other writing, but as a first-time Ali Hazelwood reader, I really enjoyed this book. So this is one I probably will reread at some point. One of the things that I did love about this book, it was actually a slow burn. I hate it when a book is a romance and they just get down to business on page 25. Can't stand that. Also, something about this book that was very different from the other books that I read this year was the presence of a child. Most books don't have like children as a main character, and this book did, and it just added a whole new layer to the dynamic between the characters in this book. The banter with this girl was outstanding. I loved it. She was also so sweet, like I would die for that little girl. And overall, it just added a different emotional layer to the characters that I feel like you don't really get to see. Yes, sometimes we get pregnancy tropes and stuff like that, but you don't actually get to see the characters themselves bonding with children and characters who will do anything to protect children. And that was just a trope that was very unexpected and I don't see very often. And it was one of my favorite parts about this book. So I will give this book love, even if it doesn't get it by most people. I think if you love it, you love it. And if you don't, you don't, and that's okay. I just want to start off by saying when I read the books in the Mossverse, I read ACOTAR, then I read Crescent City 1 and 2, then I read all of Throne of Glass, and then I read House of Flame and Shadow. Up until this book, I actually was shocked that I found myself leaning towards Crescent City a little bit more than ACOTAR and Throne of Glass. Don't ask me why, I just, for some reason, I did. I really thought, especially based off of how the second book in Crescent City left off, no spoilers, I truly thought this book was going to be my favorite book of the year, bar none. I genuinely went into this thinking this was going to be not only the best book of the year, but that no other book would even come close to touching this book for many more years to come. I gave this book 3 stars, maybe. Nobody is more disappointed than I am that this book did not work out. I was a Bryce girl. I would die on the Bryce Hill over Feyre, over Aelin. Not anymore, don't get offended, not anymore. But after this book, Bryce kind of gave me the ick. She was not a female character that I would be like proud to be friends with, unfortunately. Book 1 and book 2, absolutely. I was like, dang, that girl's gonna protect me. That girl's gonna be by my side. Like, that is a best friend that I want. After that, like, it's Aelin, it's Lysandra, it's Fair, like, I love all of them, and Bryce just really fell short for me in this. Now, there were other elements of this book that really impressed me and that I ate up. I won't spoil anything, but other love stories that developed and other friendships that developed that I loved and that brought me so much joy, but it was not enough to make up for the fact that Bryce was just really annoying to me in this book. I'm actually very glad we don't have another Crescent City book lined up for a while because I kind of need a break. I will go back and read book 1, Crescent City, because I think that is one of my favorite Mossverse books to this day. But generally, I actually just don't really care about where this series in the universe goes. Like there are way more important things in the Mossverse that I care about after reading this book. I just don't have a Crescent City hole in my heart that needs to be filled anytime soon after this book. All that being said, slight spoilers to come, but nothing extreme. If you've read all 3 of the Mossverse universes, then I understand what this book was trying to do in setting up what I think are the next books to come that Sarah J. Maas writes. But at the end of the day, the execution of what she was trying to do fell short because I ended up falling out of love with these characters when originally the Crescent City characters were my favorite and some of the most dynamic characters in the Mossverse. I guess I'm happy to say that ACOTAR and Throne of Glass are still my favorite series, but also I always thought that Crescent City needed more love, and that was before book 3 came out, and I wish that more people would read Crescent City, and I'm afraid now that because book 3 came out and it wasn't as good as people say, the Crescent City universe is gonna start getting less love, and I still think book 1 and 2 deserve a lot of love. And maybe it's just that book 1 and book 2 did such a great job that book 3 just couldn't compare. I don't know. These were some of my first urban fantasies that I'd read, so the bar was already pretty high. Who knows? Maybe it's a bridge book. I don't stand by bridge books, and I really don't like using that term, but maybe it's a bridge book because there were some Throne of Glass books that I read that I did not enjoy, and by the end of the series, I was in love with just the whole universe. So maybe that's just what book 3 in the Crescent City universe is doing. Maybe it's just one of those books that I don't love, but overall, that series is going to end very, very well. That's my hope. Fingers crossed. The book with the most unique concept that I read this year was Remarkably Bright Creatures. This book really caught me by surprise. I thought it was going to be good. I didn't think it was going to be great. This was a 5-star read for me. Imagine my surprise when I went to go see what other books the author had written, and I found out this was a debut novel. It is outstanding for a debut, and I was just really honestly blown away. But the reason this one was such a unique concept to me was because we have a sentient being, Marcellus the octopus, who is actually able to communicate. He thinks, he narrates his own chapters. He's just very, very intelligent. And then we have the other part of the book, which is narrated by actual humans. And this was a very unique concept to me because there is an unsolved murder mystery throughout this book, and Marcellus the octopus develops a relationship in the most unique ways with human beings who are connected to this murder mystery and actually helps them solve it. And that's not a spoiler, that's in the description, but that is just such a unique concept to me, and it was so beautifully executed. This is a book I will recommend to anybody, whether they like reading or not, and whether they like this genre or not. This book just had everything for me. It had a little bit of mystery, it had romance, it had platonic relationships, found family, and also overall in this book, there were some characters that I really didn't like starting off, but they redeemed themselves so well by the end of the book and really just grew a lot as a character. And I just thought it was very beautiful and very realistic, despite the fact that we have Marcellus the talking octopus, but he doesn't really talk, he just talks to you as the reader. But he finds ways to communicate with the humans around him, and it was just such a beautiful story. I loved this book so very much. Next question is a book that I read this year that I already want to reread. I'm gonna do an honorable mention of the Throne of Glass series, mostly because I read it this year in 2024, and I'm already starting my reread. I know, that's kind of crazy. And I didn't even love the first books in the Throne of Glass series, but I'm reading it with some friends now, and we're all doing a buddy read together, and I think that this is really just gonna bring magic into this series that I maybe didn't experience with those first few books, because I have people to talk about it with and share it with, and I am beyond excited to start my reread of that series and just, I don't know, switch things up. I'm gonna switch up the orders of the books. I'm gonna do the tandem read. I'm so excited. But the one book that I finished this year that I already cannot wait to do my reread is Lessons in Chemistry. I've brought this one up a couple times in this video already, but I did the audiobook for this one, and I have the physical book, and I already cannot wait to read this one. I plan to annotate this one very thoroughly, tab it up, do the whole thing, but this book was just so beautiful and magical in its own way to me. This might be a reread that I do yearly, early because I feel like it really inspired and changed me as a woman. Kind of brought to life some realities of where I want to go in my future. And this book really, really has a special place in my heart. And finally, last question is a book that I wish I had gotten around to reading this year, but I didn't. And that is Song of Achilles. This actually was gifted to me last Christmas, or maybe even the Christmas before. I've had this at least a year, maybe 2 years. I just have not gotten around to reading it. Part of me is nervous to read this because I either think I'm gonna love it or I think I'm gonna hate it, and I don't know which it is. I read Circe and loved Circe by Madeline Miller. That book was life-changing, and I've actually picked up Song of Achilles before and I've DNF'd it a couple times. So I guess I have picked it up, I just didn't get around to finishing it this year. I read the Iliad in college and really just did not resonate with Achilles' character at all. So when I picked up Song of Achilles, I found that I still didn't resonate with the character at all. And I really hope that that changes. I will be getting around to reading this next year because it is gonna be on my 25 and 2025 list. So this has to be a book that I finish next year, non-negotiable. Also, this is a really petty reason to not read this book, but it's the pages. The pages just give me the biggest ick. They're like layered, they're not smooth, and so it's really, really hard to turn the pages. Like you go to turn and you end up turning this giant chunk. Like you have to like carefully turn each page. I don't know, that's a really petty reason to not read a book. And I read Circe and it had these same pages as well. So it's not really a legit reason, but it is one of the reasons I just haven't got around to reading this book. Okay, that was a lot. That is a wrap on my 2024 book tag. I feel like I read some of the best books I have ever read in my entire life this past year. It really was a good reading year, and I learned a lot about myself through these books, and also just learned what kind of books I gravitate towards and what kind of books I don't. In general, I do tend to gravitate towards fantasy, romance, romantasy a bit more than I do any other genre, but some of my favorite books this year were contemporary and historical fictions. So I think that says a lot. You just have to find your niche books and do a lot of research before you end up buying them. But I made a rule for myself mid-year that as long as a book was above a 4-star, I probably would like it. And that has actually ended up to be true. So I just kind of know my baseline of a rating that a book needs to be before I'll invest in it. And I feel like that's worked out pretty well, but everyone has different baselines. Everyone has different genre preferences. Like for me, I don't tend to read YA because I know I don't rate those books as highly because I find the characters harder to relate to because of the age difference. But for some people, they're in that stage of life and those books make a lot of sense for them. Honestly, I have no regrets with how I've rated these books. If you read any of these books and you loved them, I would love to hear why. If you read any of these books that maybe I didn't like and they were some of your favorites of the year, feel free to drop in the comments why you loved it. I love to have discussions about books. I think it's great that everybody has different opinions, partially because there are indie authors out there who might write a book that maybe doesn't vibe with everybody, but there's gonna be somebody out there who loves that book. I think that's why it's so important that the book community doesn't love the exact same books, because we want to make sure that we're covering all kinds of books and not just the popular ones. But that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching this end of year book tag. It is my first YouTube video, so very, very exciting. I'm looking forward to posting more on this platform. If you have some ideas for book content that you would like to see, again, please drop those in the comments. I would love to hear it, and I will gladly read any book recommendations that you have or make any content that you're interested in seeing that maybe you only see on Book Talk or Instagram that you'd like to see longer versions of. I am absolutely here for it. This community is amazing and I'm so happy to be here. Again, please like and follow if you feel moved to. It mean a lot to me. Otherwise, I hope you'll have a great rest of your year and holidays if you celebrate. If not, stay warm, stay cozy, and keep on reading. Love you.